Is being selective with your words just a matter of semantics, or is there some untapped power that you could be harnessing through a more refined and intentional use of your language? Welcome. I'm Clark Korb, a holistic health practitioner offering some pragmatic insights to help you live a happier, more empowered life and embody your optimum potential. Today, I'll be exploring how more intentional use of our everyday language may contribute significantly to improving not only how we feel and the effectiveness of our communication, but also the desirability of our outcomes. So, as a kid, I was always intrigued by language. I loved practicing for spelling bees. I loved learning new vocabulary. And in high school, I had some fantastic English teachers throughout really all of my years through a public high school in Montana. And I remember in particular my sophomore year being one where there was this tremendous buildup, more so of vocabulary. There seemed to be a greater focus on that. And by my junior year, I had to kind of learn how to tweeze and refine that a little bit. And my teacher in that junior year, I remember specifically getting feedback that was something to the degree of finally submitting a paper that was superior to the vocabulary-laden tomes I had submitted recently. So thank you, Sue Bach. I still remember that all these years later. And she was right. I had the desire to use language that felt rich, but I was kind of overdoing it and losing some of the power with that. Well, the idea when people throw around semantics, something being an issue of just semantics, it's typically used dismissively. They're quibbling that minor differences in wording or definition aren't substantive if there's an argument or a point that's trying to be made. But literally, semantics is the study of meaning in language. And just as we define synonyms as words that are either the same or nearly the same in meaning, the reality is that no two words have exactly the same meaning. Otherwise, we wouldn't have different words. And there's a tremendous power in language. And I believe it was Wayne Dyer, an author that I love so much, that had introduced the concept, or at least it was introduced to me this way, that speaking is literally the first form of physical manifestation. In other words, as we're speaking, we're literally creating sound, we're vibrating the molecules around us, we're creating sound using our words. And that is, in one way, a physical manifestation of what's before was concept, before those words were spoken. And the point in all of this is that choosing our language intentionally matters. There's a lot of power in words. It isn't just a matter of what sounds nice. It can literally mean the difference in putting energy on what is wanted versus unwanted that can very much substantially affect an outcome with only a subtle but oftentimes very powerful change in a little bit of language. So let me start off giving a couple of simple examples of this. If you think of the two terms trim versus skinny, take a moment and just embody those in your mind when you think of someone being trim or versus someone being skinny. Do you have the same picture in mind? Both of those meanings imply that someone has very little body fat. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that most of us men would prefer being called trim over being skinny, since skinny can imply a lack of muscle or muscle mass or definition, and skinny can often be associated with being frail or weak. It's not the same as any of those, but that's a common association. Another one is being careful versus mindful. So, careful often focuses on taking care to avoid an undesired outcome. If someone says be careful, they're basically placing energy on the potential imminent doom of some action or a scenario that you might be in. There's a focus on fear or a scarcity mentality. If you're leaving someone's house and they say drive carefully, it's almost a language structure that suggests that otherwise you might be reckless or negligent in your driving, and they may very likely not be intending that, but there's a bit of that sort of coupled into the statement. First is the idea of mindful. Mindfulness, instead of being careful, is very different. No one says drive mindfully, although that's actually, I think, more true to the intent that they're offering in this sense. And so being mindful invites this awareness, this openness to seeing with a broader perspective what is around you, what's potentially a pitfall, but also not focusing too much energy on the pitfall in that sense. Instead of being careful or more scarcity or fear oriented, it's being more open, having a broader view, if you will. Another example, which has many different applications in context, is the notion of freedom versus security. And I'm going to point out a few of them here because I think this is a big thing that can either hold people back or misconstrain or misalign their desired intention with what they actually project onto what freedom and what security mean. Often, freedom and security are considered to be in opposition to each other. You sacrifice some freedom to gain security or vice versa. An example of this is when we're traveling, we typically are okay with sacrificing the convenience or freedom of just being able to waltz right up to our gate with instead passing through security. We really don't have a choice for that. But that security screening for passengers and luggage and whatnot allows for us to have safe passage to, and ultimately one might argue it's from having that security that gives us the freedom to travel. So freedom and security aren't necessarily in opposition to each other. I think a particularly great example for this is wearing a motorcycle helmet. I used to be a Motorcycle Safety Foundation instructor, and the concept some people have is that wearing a helmet is often just considered only something to be used in the worst case to prevent you from dying or having a significant injury if you're in a crash. The reality is, in my experience, both as a motorcycle rider and in what I tried to impart to my students in class, was that wearing a helmet actually enhances your freedom to enjoy the ride, to maintain control of the motorcycle, and also to mitigate unpleasant elements of the environment. For example, a bug hitting your face when you're going 65, 70 miles an hour, or weather variations, along with, of course, having the additional benefit of protecting you in the worst case scenario of a crash. But the emphasis wasn't placed on the crashing. In fact, we also taught directional steering, and that where you look is literally where the bike is going to go. The bike tends to lean in the direction of your body movement since you control the bike by leaning. In both cases of the directional steering and wearing a helmet, the idea is that you focus on your desired outcome as opposed to the undesired consequence. But the desired behavior, wearing a helmet, and focusing on where you're going is keeping you in the safest possible environment. As another example, in the financial realm, people often use financial freedom and financial security. They're really more considered equals as opposed to antagonistic concepts. Financial freedom, folks tend to associate with having time freedom, so not trading your time for dollars to be able to make a living. And financial security is typically more related to being able to weather financial downturns or emergencies. And the reality is that seeking security isn't guaranteed in either case. And even if you have time freedom, it can lend to an undesired consequence. If you have so much time freedom where you have excessive idle time, your life may feel void of meaning. And that notion of security, financial security built up in a portfolio, is not guaranteed. Assets are always subject to market valuations. For example, portfolios can tank, property values can plummet, and liabilities of assets can skyrocket and erode profit. So in other words, even as we're striving for financial freedom or financial security, it's always a relative measurement. And in relationships, I think this is another really juicy area for this. If we're looking at freedom and security, often people think that a relationship is the sacrifice of freedom of being able to date or be with other people, has the perceived benefit of gaining emotional safety or stability or maybe resources with a committed partner. The reality is being in a secure relationship, even being married, for example, has absolutely no guarantee of that sustained emotional connection or emotional safety that you might be seeking. In fact, in that case, one could argue that you have neither freedom nor security. And there's also the possibility that being in a well-aligned relationship may actually give you more freedom to discover and express your authentic self than would be otherwise possible, assuming you have a partner who is emotionally present and holds that space for you. So the point in all of this is we can find these examples and counterexamples of seeming paradoxes based on the meanings we attach to them, and that if we choose intentional language around what we're trying to create, it shapes our intentional living and vice versa. So the two really work together in a much more powerful way than, in general, I believe we give credit. It's super easy to fall into a trap of adopting common patterns of language and subsequently common patterns of ideation of how things are. And as with any unexamined practice, whether it's using language or setting a goal or a desired outcome, you might be leaning the ladder against the wrong wall, so to speak. And as you ascend the ladder, not really discover that it's misdirected or misaligned for your true intentions until you're near the top. So as an alternative to adopting language as we do sort of by default, If you identify the true essence of what's desired, you can then eschew fear-based concepts and language of scarcity and instead embrace love-based concepts and language of abundance. And it's important that we select this language that is more accurately and intentionally aligned with the concept that we're seeking. And as we're navigating experiences of what necessarily didn't work out so well for us, and we tune ourselves more to what is it we want to create instead, being really intentional about choosing language that most closely matches this desired intention is very powerful. In fact, the more time that we spend being a little bit more intentional about the language we use to describe or set our intention for what we are creating, we may end up generating an entirely new conceptualization around what we think we actually want. So using better aligned language or intentional meaning helps shape our expectations, our behaviors, and outcomes. So some examples of this: instead of focusing on, let's say you're trying to compliment your partner on being skinny or trim, a more pure aspect of what your intention is of stating that they're attractive might be reflecting that they look healthy or vibrant or full of energy. Even though none of us can control how someone else interprets a compliment or an intended compliment, if you get more to the core of what you're really trying to communicate, it's a stronger, more powerful delivery of what you're intending. And along this concept of freedom or security, most people really want both. We want to feel free and we want to feel secure. And instead of looking at them as a paradox, getting to the essence of what we really are stating with this is living life on our own terms. And if we come from that place, then what does that actually mean for you? So if we look at the financial example, for some people, that's merely starting off with just making more money than they spend. And you can have some control over both aspects of that, growing your income, reducing your expenses. Maybe it's something where you're evaluating what percentage of your earnings come from more active sources versus more passive sources, so that you can free up more of your active time, trading less time for dollars and more having income come from other sources that doesn't require you trading time for money, for example. Or there may be the issue of figuring out what balance of time is spent on activities which give you joy and satisfaction and meaning. And in terms of time of enjoying being in the present and planning for the future, maybe it's reconfiguring or looking more objectively at what balance of resources you're directing toward enjoying life now, which is determinate, versus planning for the future, which is indeterminate, since you don't know how much future you'll have or what your circumstances might necessarily be. It's not an either or. It's about having a clearer sense of what you're really trying to accomplish. What does that balance mean? What does financial freedom, what does financial security really mean? Not what someone told you it should mean. Along that freedom and security notion for relationships, does freedom actually mean not having a partner? Sometimes people have this concern, whether they're in a relationship or not. Having a partner might be a loss of freedom. Or does being partnered give you the expectation of having security, whether that security is emotionally, materially, or otherwise experienced? What if you completely decouple the notion of freedom and security from having anything to do with the partnership? What does that make possible for you? If you're partnered, maybe consider giving your partner a new title, like Chief Co-Creator of Joy, as opposed to person who's supposed to make me feel secure, for example. And if you're single, what if you completely decouple the notion of seeking security in the form of love or belonging or acceptance from requiring a partner? There are many ways to receive all these things which do not require being coupled. So in all of this, these are just some examples to help you potentially identify some not only belief systems, but language constructs that reinforce belief systems that you may not realize are in place. And the challenge I would offer to you is to make a note of common language constructs that you use on a daily basis. These can either be with self-talk or talk with others. Identify those which may be disempowering for you, and choose some alternate language which more closely reflects what it is you really desire or would like to create. What areas of self-talk that you struggle with the most? Or what are some areas that are a challenge for you where you'd like to create some more empowering language to support a desired direction that you have? Let me know in the comments below. If you know of anyone who may benefit from what I've shared here, please forward this video to them. And if you found some value in what I've discussed today, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It's free, it only takes a moment, and it really helps support the growth of this channel. Thank you so much for tuning in.